So I'm back on the flat fender. So for right now, I'm not gonna have time to do the transmission swap, the SM420. I'm gonna have to do that, and I am gonna cover that content, but I'm gonna have to wait until I get back from the fall color tour. My transmission's not here, and there's too much work to do without having the transmission here to commit to that. So I'm gonna kind of go through the front axle on this Jeep real quick. And the reason I'm not swapping the axles is because with the tranny transfer case I was gonna run, it was gonna change the rear axle to center drive, and I was building a heavier duty version of Dana 30 for the front. And no, a Dana 30 is not heavy duty, but in a flat fender it is. So I'm gonna kind of go through this front end, and it's not gonna be a waste of time because I'm gonna redo this 48 208 over here. And if I get this axle all cherried out, it will serve me well for my trip. But then when I do this 2A, I can just unbolt the axle and swap it into the 2A. So I have a couple things I'm gonna address here. My Kingpins feel quite notchy, so I think the bearings for the Kingpins have pits in them. The wiper seals aren't leaking horrific, but I'm gonna redo the wiper seals. And this is a closed knuckle axle, so there's like a wiper seal here on this ball. I'm gonna redo all this, and the oil you see down here is because the axle seals that are in here, and here are leaking and allowing gear oil to run down the axle tube, and it's not as heavy as the grease that's in this knuckle, and it drips out. So I got that on both sides. Gear oil dripping. There's not a spot on this side, but I wipe the spot on this side up almost every day. My diff cover's leaking also, and the drain plug and the pinion seal. So it's just kind of grimy. So I'm gonna take the outers off, completely off. I'm gonna pull this front end out. I'm gonna take it outside and wire brush it. So I'm gonna back up real quick. I'm going to take the outers off. I'm gonna drain the axle. I'm gonna change the pinion seal. With the outers off, I'm gonna take the axle outside, wire brush it, paint it, bring it back in, do the Kingpins, the inner axle seals. I might change something out on the carrier. I'll show you that if I do it. And put it back together, and then the front end will be done. And then I'm gonna move on to the rear end. The rear end, I think I'm gonna pull the full float 44. I have a full float 44 in my high hood over here that has the same differential gears, 538 gears, a Detroit locker, and it also has 11-inch drums like the rear of this. So I'm gonna probably do similar to what I'm doing with the front. With the rear bolted in, front and rear axles will be completely done for this 48 when I get back from the trip. And I can start on my other axles for this Jeep with the transmission swap. So I've got the cover pulled, the front differentials draining. I've got the hubs, starting to pull the hubs off. So on these Selectro hubs, the cap is held on by the inboard screws. The outboard screws hold the guts all inside the hub. So if you just take the inboard screws out, you can slip the hub off, then take the nuts, the bolts out of this part of the hub, and then this will slip off. So so the inboard screws, you take those out, they fit in this groove right here. Once you take those screws out, that'll slip off, and take these bolts out. And then I just tap this, and then this will come off. So I've been through this pretty recently when I did the disc brakes and stuff on this. So I'm gonna tap these lock washers out flat, take the nuts off. I'm gonna take the calipers off and hang them. then take the locking nuts off, and then I'll pull the rotor off, and then the spindle and the axles out, and then I'll go through how to take the kingpins apart. So the other day when I was talking about the way these locking nuts work on the Dana 30 that I was taking apart, this is how they should have been. So see how this washer is bent over on the nut? That's the correct way. So the Dana 30 I took apart, neither one of these were bent, so there was no locking or tension for the spindle nuts. So I got to straighten that out, and then I'll be able to take that outside nut off. So I got the rotors and hubs off both sides now. My only mishap doing the whole thing is when I was pulling this side off, the outer bearing fell into this crud here. So I'm gonna have to clean that bearing out and repack it. I made myself a little note here. Oh, I got the calipers hung too. I'm gonna have to take those completely off. I just don't want to yet. So I made myself a little note here. These caliper brackets for the Chevy calipers don't go on visually how you would think they would. So I marked them, so when I go to put them back on, it'll go real quick. So next step is zip these spindle bolts out. These have bolts, not studs and nuts like the later axles. So I'm gonna zip these spindle bolts out, pull the spindle off, and then the axle out. Now, when I pull the axle out, these early Jeeps could have 3 different style joints on the axle joint. It could be a Spicer U-joint, it could be a Bendix style that has 5 balls and a pin, or it could also be a Rapezza joint. And very common for them to be different side to side, even factory. Sometimes they're different side to side because one broke and somebody replaced it with something else, because they're all interchangeable if you have the complete axle, you know, axle assembly, stub and inner. So I've had this apart, but I can't remember what I got going on in here. So I will show a video of that, what I find in there. So this comes apart just like the Dana 30 stuff. So these are just bolts. So I'm gonna zip these out, pull the backing plate off for the caliper mount / backing plate off, and then pull the spindle off, and I'll be looking right at the axle shaft. So I got the brake caliper mounts off, pulled the spindles off. I used the spindle puller that I showed the other day on the Dana 30 on the slide hammer. And what I have in here is Bendix joints. So there's 5 balls, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 balls. And then the axles kind of have like a paw on the end, and the balls sit in the 4 arms of the paw and 1 in the center to keep the spacing. So there's nothing really that holds the stub to the inner shaft. It's just kind of put in there and retained with the spindle. So I'm gonna slowly, carefully try to slip it out with it all falling apart. It looks like it's pretty well lubricated, and doesn't appear to be any debris in there. So I'm probably just gonna add grease, not gonna take that grease out. So I'm gonna try to carefully slip that out. I'll look at it and maybe I might clean it up and change the grease, but if it looks okay as I pull it out, I'm gonna leave it alone. And once again, this is the Bendix style. They could have a Spicer U-joint style in there, and then those U-joints were unsealed. Or it could have a Rapezza joint, which was like a modern CV joint, so with 6 balls. But I'll kind of show this a little bit later when I get the knuckles off, what this actually looks like. So I got both axles out. You can kind of see what I'm talking about. See, there's 2 balls, 3 balls, and then 2 on the other side. And there's nothing holding this together. It would just slip apart. I want to show you. So this is the the steering knuckle, and these are Kingpins, so there's a bearing and race in here with the trunnion and the shim to control the preload. So I'm gonna replace the bearings. I bet you they're pretty notchy, and clean all this stuff up and paint it. But this gear oil down here that's dripping out of this Kingpin, if you look in the axle down there, I don't know if I can get a light to go down that tube, but there's standing gear oil in that axle and there shouldn't be, and that's what's causing this to drip. So I'm gonna get this all cleaned up, and I will kind of go into how to take these apart. And this axle hasn't been into, I mean, I had it apart to do an article in 4Low when I installed the lock right in the center section, but this is a factory gasket here, so pretty cool. I mean, this gasket's 75 years old, so what can you, how often do you see a 75-year-old gasket intact here? So it's pretty neat. I will get this apart, and this is kind of that notchy feeling. It's not turning the axle or anything now, so this is in the bearings. It's kind of notchy. And then I'm replacing this wiper seal here on the ball. So I got the Kingpin just about on the Kingpin's just about unbolted. These are mostly studs here, so I've just got a couple holding it. I took the seals off the back of the knuckle, so seals off the back of the knuckle. These ones are big, like cast aluminum or pot metal seal housings. I haven't seen any like that in a while, so I'm gonna get this all taken apart. Now when I take this apart, there's normally shims under these, so I'm gonna mark where the shim locations are. Normally they just shim on the top, so I'm gonna mark the shim locations though, and that'll be my starting point when I set it up with the new bearings. So I'm gonna pull this stud out, pull this cap off. There should be a shim under there. Pull these nuts off, pull this cap off. Probably not a shim under there. And then these will come out, and then the knuckle will come off. So I got the knuckle off, and I'm looking at the bearings. They're not the greatest. They're not super pitted. I've seen these with huge pits in them. This side isn't super pitted, but you can see it's had some water in here. And so I'm gonna drive these races out. Drive the races out, top and bottom. And this was the top trunnion, and there's just one shim on there. If you can see, there's one shim, none on the bottom. And these, I remembered these seals are military Jeeps, so M38A1, this would have came with this pot metal seal instead of the sheet metal ones. So I'm gonna kind of wipe the grease out of this, take the other side apart, and then I'm gonna change the pinion seal, clean up the front mounting surface where the cover goes, and I'm gonna take it outside and wire brush it.